The US dollar is more than just a currency. It's the linchpin of the global financial system, a symbol of American economic might, and a tool that shapes geopolitics in ways few understand. Today, nearly every international transaction, whether in oil, technology, or grain, passes through the US dollar. Banks, corporations, and governments rely on it for stability. But this dominance comes with an unspoken rule. Deviation is risky. Defying the dollar is not merely an economic choice. It's a political and strategic gamble that can alter a country's trajectory. Since the end of World War II, the dollar has been a global reserve currency. The Bretton Woods system cemented its position, tying it to gold while other nations pegged their currencies to the dollar. Even after Bretton Woods ended in 1971, the world continued to trust the dollar because of the United States' economic and military might. Petrodollars, the practice of trading oil exclusively in dollars, ensured that nations had to maintain dollar reserves to engage in the global energy market. For decades, compliance with the dollar was almost automatic. Nations had to play by its rules to participate in the global economy. But what happens when a country chooses not to play along? When it dares to defy the dollar, the consequences can be swift, painful, and meticulously engineered. The United States has developed a multi-layered system of incentives and penalties to maintain dollar dominance. These range from access to SWIFT, the global interbank messaging system, to outright sanctions and financial blacklisting. If a nation attempts to bypass the dollar by trading in euros, yuan, or a local currency, it risks isolation from the global financial network. Consider Iran. For decades, Iran's decision to sell oil outside the dollar system, particularly after the 1979 revolution, provoked a calculated response from the US. Sanctions targeted Iranian banks, restricted international transactions, and limited access to foreign reserves. The economy shrank, inflation surged, and the currency plummeted. Ordinary citizens bore the brunt of this financial coercion, while the government faced escalating internal pressures. Iran's defiance of the dollar demonstrated both the power of financial leverage and the lengths to which Washington would go to preserve dollar hegemony. Even beyond sanctions, defiance triggers subtler pressures. International institutions like the IMF and World Bank, heavily influenced by US policy, can delay loans, increase scrutiny, or impose stringent conditions. Credit ratings for the defiant country may be downgraded, making borrowing more expensive. Investors, wary of regulatory repercussions or secondary sanctions, often pull out capital, creating capital flight and currency instability. Simply put, attempting to step off the dollar-led track invites a cascade of financial consequences. The strategic use of the dollar is not random, it's a calculated form of economic statecraft. The United States doesn't always need to send tanks or missiles. Sometimes the mere threat of cutting off dollar access is enough to enforce compliance. A country that continues to trade outside the dollar system risks exclusion from global markets, freezing of assets held abroad, and political marginalization. The message is clear. Dollar defiance is more than a financial decision. It's a challenge to use influence and a gamble with existential stakes. Yet resistance persists. Nations like Russia, China, and recently Turkey have explored alternatives to circumvent the dollar, using bilateral trade agreements, digital currencies, and local currency settlements. These efforts reflect not just ambition but necessity. In a world where the dollar dominates, being dependent on Washington's financial infrastructure is both a vulnerability and a political constraint. The push to bypass the dollar shows that while the US may hold immense power, it's never absolute. Over time, structural cracks emerge whenever countries seek alternatives. To understand the full implications of defying the dollar, we must examine not only the financial consequences but also the political, social, and strategic costs. The United States has weaponized its currency not merely to extract compliance, but to reshape global behavior and maintain long-term supremacy. A single decision to step off the dollar-led track can trigger years of financial isolation, domestic economic hardship, and international pressure. The story of what happens to countries that challenge the dollar is not just a tale of sanctions and lost reserves. It is a story of how a single currency can shape geopolitics, bend national policy, and influence the daily lives of millions. It is the ultimate illustration of financial power as a tool of statecraft, and the cautionary tale for any nation considering independence from. When a country defies the US dollar, the consequences unfold through multiple interconnected channels. The most visible tool is sanctions. Dollar sanctions are not just ordinary penalties, they are surgical, systemic, and designed to isolate a nation from the entire global financial ecosystem. Banks, investors, and corporations worldwide are deeply integrated into dollar-based transactions. A sanction that cuts off access to dollars effectively freezes a country out of the system that fuels international trade, energy, and finance. Consider the mechanics. Most international trade, especially oil, gas, and commodities, is priced in dollars. If a nation cannot convert its goods into dollars or cannot transact with other countries in dollars, trade grinds to a halt. Exporters can't receive payments, importers can't pay for essential goods, and reserves quickly dwindle. Central banks struggle to stabilize their currencies because they lack access to global liquidity. This is not theoretical. It is how the United States has repeatedly pressured countries like Iran, Venezuela, and North Korea. Sanctions also extend to secondary actors. Even if a company or bank outside the U.S. wants to engage with a sanctioned country, doing business in dollars makes them vulnerable to penalties. This creates a ripple effect where global actors self-censor out of fear of U.S. enforcement. The country under pressure becomes increasingly isolated, even from markets that theoretically should be open to it. Essentially, the U.S. outsources enforcement to the global banking system itself, amplifying the reach of dollar power without firing a shot. The economic impact is immediate and visible. Currency depreciation, skyrocketing inflation, and shortages of essential goods hit the population first. Ordinary citizens feel the pinch as food, medicine, and energy prices soar. The government, meanwhile, faces pressure from both domestic unrest and an inability to fund key initiatives. This combination weakens the state's internal authority, making it more vulnerable to political instability. Sanctions aren't just financial, they are psychological and strategic, eroding confidence in governance. Iran's experience provides a clear example. After U.S. sanctions intensified in the 2010s, the rial plummeted, inflation surged past 40%, and imports of essential goods became sporadic. Despite having oil reserves, Iran struggled to monetize them because buyers feared secondary sanctions. The economy contracted, unemployment rose, and social unrest intensified. The dollar, in effect, became a weapon, compressing Iran's economic life while the U.S. exerted influence from afar. But the damage isn't confined to immediate economics. Long-term effects of dollar coercion include stunted industrial development, reduced foreign investment, and chronic capital flight. Countries often divert resources to survive sanctions rather than invest in productive capacity. Infrastructure projects stall, technology transfer slows, and innovation suffers. The U.S., by controlling the dollar, indirectly shapes which countries can modernize, industrialize, or participate fully in global markets. Even nations that try to hedge against dollar dependency face challenges. Russia, China, and others have developed mechanisms to bypass the dollar through bilateral trade, alternative clearing systems, and local currency settlements, but these alternatives come with higher transaction costs, limited liquidity, and complex coordination requirements. The more a country resists, the more sophisticated its financial engineering must be, and even then, full independence from dollar influence is extremely difficult. Dollar weaponization also leverages timing and expectations. U.S. authorities can announce sanctions months or years in advance, creating uncertainty that freezes investment and disrupts markets. Businesses that might consider long-term projects hesitate, credit markets tighten, and capital inflows dry up. The threat of action becomes as powerful as action itself, reinforcing the dominance of the dollar without requiring constant enforcement. Ultimately, defying the dollar is not simply about economic inconvenience, it reshapes a country's entire financial ecosystem. Access to global markets, investment, and energy flows is contingent on compliance. Even small deviations invite disproportionate consequences, and over time, these pressures accumulate, forcing many nations to reconsider their policies or pay a steep economic price. The dollar, therefore, functions as both a tool of leverage and a mechanism of discipline. Through sanctions, secondary pressures, and control over global payment systems, the United States can coerce behavior far beyond its borders. For countries that attempt defiance, the lesson is stark. The economic and political costs are immediate, severe, and often prolonged. The global economy, anchored by the dollar, becomes both the battlefield and the weapon. History provides clear examples of what happens when nations challenge the dominance of the U.S. dollar. These cases reveal a consistent pattern. Financial pressure escalates into economic strain, social unrest, and geopolitical vulnerability. From Iran to Russia, the consequences of defying the dollar have been severe, showing that currency control is as much about strategy as it is about money. Iran is perhaps the most cited example. In 1979, after the Iranian Revolution, the new Islamic Republic sought to assert its independence, including in its oil dealings. Initially, Iran attempted to sell oil to other nations outside the dollar system, but it quickly became clear that the global economy was tightly anchored to the greenback. By the 1980s and intensifying in the 2010s, the United States imposed strict sanctions, blocking Iranian banks from accessing the SWIFT system, a crucial global messaging network for dollar transactions. Without access, even friendly nations had difficulty conducting trade with Iran. As a result, inflation soared, imports of critical goods collapsed, and domestic industries struggled to survive. Iran's economy became heavily insular, dependent on barter and limited foreign partners willing to risk secondary sanctions. Venezuela offers another striking example. When President Hugo Chavez and later Nicolas Maduro attempted to circumvent the dollar and sell oil in euros or other currencies, the United States responded with sanctions targeting Venezuela's state-owned oil company PDVSA and restricting access to the U.S. financial system. This effectively blocked Venezuela from converting its oil revenue into usable currency for global trade. The result was catastrophic: hyperinflation, widespread shortages, collapsing infrastructure, and mass emigration. The dollar, weaponized through the financial system, had turned Venezuela from one of the wealthiest oil exporters into a humanitarian crisis zone. Even Russia, a major global economy with vast energy resources, has not been immune. Following its annexation of Crimea in 2014, the US and EU imposed targeted sanctions on Russian banks, energy firms, and individuals, freezing assets and restricting dollar access. Russia could no longer easily access international financing in dollars, and its companies faced barriers to purchasing critical technology from the West. In response, Russia began diversifying its financial systems, creating alternatives like the SPF's clearing system and promoting trade in euros and yuan. Yet the cost was clear: increased transaction costs, reduced foreign investment, and long-term economic friction. Defying the dollar had strategic motives, but the economic price was significant. These case studies highlight a crucial insight: the dollar's power extends beyond simple trade. It controls capital flows, credit access, and international liquidity. When a country steps outside the system, it cannot easily borrow, import, or invest without facing enormous obstacles. Every transaction becomes a negotiation with risk, and even allies must carefully consider the consequences of non-compliance. Secondary sanctions amplify this effect. Countries or companies that do business with a sanctioned nation risk being cut off from U.S. financial markets, losing access to dollar transactions, or facing fines. This creates a self-reinforcing loop. Global actors avoid sanctioned nations to protect their own access, magnifying isolation and economic stress for the defiant country. Even nations that attempt to remain neutral often find themselves pressured to comply. The psychological impact is equally profound. Citizens of targeted countries quickly experience declining standards of living, shortages, and financial instability. Domestic businesses struggle to plan or invest, and public confidence in government diminishes. Leaders face pressure from internal unrest while simultaneously grappling with constrained external options. The dollar, in this sense, functions not just as a currency but as a tool of coercion, shaping behavior through fear and scarcity. A striking aspect of dollar weaponization is its stealth. Unlike conventional warfare, the U.S. often does not need to invade, bomb, or physically occupy a country. The threat of sanctions and financial exclusion alone can achieve policy objectives. Access to global capital markets, insurance, shipping, and trade networks depends on compliance with dollar rules. Those who defy it are often forced to adapt, negotiate, or suffer prolonged economic and political consequences. These examples make one principle abundantly clear: in the modern era, defying the US dollar is a high-stakes gamble. It invites not just financial isolation but cascading economic crises, domestic unrest, and international vulnerability. From Tehran to Caracas to Moscow, nations learn that the global financial system is a battlefield, and the dollar is one of the most powerful weapons in the arsenal. The weaponization of the US dollar does not just impact the economy of a single country, it reshapes global geopolitics, alliances, and strategic decision-making. When a nation defies or challenges the dollar, the consequences extend far beyond trade balances and inflation, influencing military strategies, diplomatic alignments, and long-term economic policies worldwide. One key aspect is the leverage the U.S. gains over its allies. Dollar dominance allows Washington to enforce compliance even among friendly nations. Consider countries heavily reliant on the dollar for trade or debt financing: Japan, Germany, and Saudi Arabia, for example. They must carefully align with U.S. financial policies, from sanctions against rogue states to participation in dollar-based international agreements. A refusal or hesitation risks being cut off from critical financial channels or markets. This dynamic turns economic policy into a subtle instrument of foreign policy, where currency access is both carrot and stick. Beyond allies, nations seeking strategic autonomy face immense challenges. Russia, China, and Iran have all pursued alternative financial systems, trying to reduce dependence on the dollar. Russia's SPFS payment system and the creation of the BRICS-backed contingent reserve arrangement are part of a broader effort to circumvent U.S. financial dominance. China's Belt and Road Initiative and push for the yuan in cross-border trade are similar attempts. Yet, despite these efforts, the dollar remains deeply embedded in global trade, commodity pricing, and banking infrastructure. Attempts to bypass it often result in higher transaction costs, limited liquidity, and reduced foreign investment. In essence, defiance is possible, but it comes at a steep price. Commodity markets provide another avenue where dollar weaponization exerts influence. Oil, the lifeblood of modern economies, is almost exclusively priced in dollars. Countries that attempt to sell oil in other currencies like Iran and, at times, Venezuela face immediate market and financial repercussions. Buyers may hesitate due to the risk of secondary sanctions or lack of access to dollar-based clearing systems. Even when countries attempt to diversify, the global oil market's dependence on the dollar reinforces U.S. leverage. Dollar control translates directly into energy, diplomacy, and strategic influence, shaping alliances and economic policy worldwide. The ripple effects extend to global financial stability. By controlling access to the world's reserve currency, the U.S. can create conditions that either stabilize or destabilize entire regions. Consider the 1998 Russian financial crisis. Sudden dollar-denominated debt demands, combined with restricted access to international capital, accelerated Moscow's default and systemic collapse. Similarly, when the U.S. threatens sanctions, capital flight, currency devaluation, and inflation become imminent risks. Nations are forced to manage domestic stability while anticipating external financial pressures, a complex balancing act that impacts policy and politics at every level. Dollar weaponization also intersects with technological and trade control. International payment systems, multinational banking networks, and even global shipping and insurance often operate in U.S. dollars. By controlling these channels, the U.S. can influence international commerce far beyond traditional military or diplomatic means. Companies across continents weigh the risks of sanctions and dollar exclusion when planning investments or partnerships. This creates a subtle but pervasive influence. Even without overt threats, nations and corporations internalize the rules dictated by dollar dominance. A less obvious but equally potent effect is the psychological leverage exerted on global markets. Investors, banks, and multinational corporations continuously monitor U.S. sanctions policy and dollar liquidity. Expectations of compliance or default affect interest rates, credit availability, and foreign direct investment. When the U.S. signals that certain transactions or partnerships may be penalized, markets react instantly. Capital moves, currencies fluctuate, and the economic landscape shifts, all in response to perceived dollar power. In sum, the U.S. dollar functions as a tool of geopolitical orchestration. It allows Washington to shape alliances, enforce compliance, and incentivize behaviors that align with its strategic objectives. Nations attempting to defy this system must contend with economic isolation, capital scarcity, and long-term strategic vulnerability. Defiance is costly, not only in dollars but in political influence, economic stability, and international credibility. The global implications are clear. Dollar weaponization is not merely a financial strategy, it is a mechanism for shaping world order. Countries that ignore its power do so at their own peril, often discovering that the consequences of defiance ripple across their economy, society, and political legitimacy simultaneously. Defying the US dollar is not a theoretical exercise, it is a high-stakes gamble with real-world consequences. Nations that attempt to operate outside the dollar system face a combination of financial, political, and strategic pressures that can destabilize economies, challenge governments, and reshape international relations. Yet, understanding these consequences also reveals the strategies some countries employ to survive or even thrive despite the overwhelming dominance of the dollar. The immediate consequence of defiance is often financial isolation. Countries excluded from dollar-based transactions lose access to international banking networks, foreign investment, and trade financing. Iran's post-2018 experience is instructive. After the U.S. withdrew from the nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions, the Iranian economy faced severe liquidity shortages. Oil sales denominated in dollars or euros were blocked. Foreign banks refused to handle Iranian transactions, and global companies disengaged to avoid penalties. This created a domino effect. Import restrictions drove inflation. Currency devaluation undermined domestic purchasing power, and public discontent surged. Secondary sanctions amplify these effects. Unlike traditional sanctions targeting a single country, secondary sanctions threaten foreign entities including banks, corporations, and even allied governments that engage with the sanctioned nation. This expands the reach of the dollar weapon far beyond U.S. borders. For instance, European, Asian, and Middle Eastern banks had to weigh whether continuing trade with Iran would risk their access to the dollar system or U.S. markets. Many chose caution, effectively isolating Iran from the global economy. This demonstrates a core principle. The dollar acts not only as money but as leverage. Its very circulation enforces compliance globally. Yet, some nations have found ways to mitigate these pressures, often at great cost. Russia, for example, has pursued currency diversification, increasing trade settlements in rubles, yuan, and euros. It has established parallel financial infrastructure like the SPFS payment system to reduce reliance on SWIFT, the global messaging system dominated by the dollar. China, similarly, has promoted the yuan in Belt and Road Initiative contracts, incentivized commodity trades outside the dollar, and developed its own cross-border payment networks. These strategies do not dismantle dollar dominance overnight, but they offer partial insulation against its effects. Defiance also forces countries to confront internal vulnerabilities. Dollar weaponization exploits the interconnectedness of global finance. Nations heavily reliant on imported goods, external debt, or foreign technology find themselves at particular risk. Venezuela, for instance, suffered severe shortages and hyperinflation as its oil revenues, denominated in dollars, became inaccessible. Without alternative revenue streams or domestic industrial resilience, the economy spiraled into chaos. This highlights a key lesson. The ability to survive outside the dollar system often depends on economic self-sufficiency, strategic reserves, and diversified trade partnerships. Beyond economics, defiance carries political consequences. Governments face domestic pressure as inflation, unemployment, and scarcity rise. Public discontent can translate into protests, regime instability, or policy concessions. Internationally, nations may struggle to form alliances, as even potential partners are wary of secondary sanctions or losing access to the dollar-dominated system. This creates a geopolitical squeeze. Defiant countries may gain independence in theory, but in practice, they operate under heightened vulnerability. The strategic implications extend to global finance. Dollar weaponization has created an asymmetric system where a single nation can influence international trade, commodity pricing, and cross-border investments. Countries that refuse to align with this system must develop alternative infrastructures, currencies, and alliances, tasks that require decades, resources, and diplomatic skill. Meanwhile, the U.S. can selectively wield this influence to enforce foreign policy goals without firing a single shot, demonstrating the unprecedented power of currency as a tool of coercion. Yet, history also suggests limits to dollar power. Overuse of sanctions or coercion can encourage long-term resistance, prompting countries to innovate around dollar dependency. Initiatives like the BRICS currency proposals, bilateral trade in local currencies, and alternative payment systems illustrate how nations gradually chip away at monopoly control. The process is slow and fraught with risk, but it is a testament to the persistent tension between economic dominance and sovereignty. Ultimately, the story of the dollar as a weapon teaches an enduring lesson. Global finance is inseparable from geopolitics. Access to the world's reserve currency can dictate trade, shape alliances, and even decide wars. Countries that defy the dollar pay a price in economic hardship, political risk, and strategic vulnerability, but they also reveal the inherent fragility of a system built on dependence rather than resilience. The dollar's power is immense, but it is not absolute. Nations seeking autonomy must understand both the consequences of defiance and the strategies required to navigate them. Currency in this sense is not just money, it is influence, leverage, and ultimately, a mechanism through which the global balance of power is maintained. Those who master its rules can survive. Those who ignore them risk being crushed by a system they cannot control.